I will never forget the knock on the door that morning. It wasn't just loud, it was deliberate, like a verdict already decided, only waiting to be read aloud. I peeked through the peephole and saw a woman in a severe dark suit and a man holding a folder. Both were from Child Protective Services. My heart froze and my hands turned to ice. I didn't even consider the possibility of a mistake. Deep down, I knew this was connected to my husband's family. They had been waiting for a reason, any reason, to declare me an unfit mother. I opened the door, and the woman immediately asked, "Mrs. Henley, we received a report about unsafe conditions for your children. May we come in?" I stood there gripping the doorknob, feeling the weight of the question press into my chest. Behind me in the living room, I could hear my son and daughter quietly playing, their laughter suddenly fragile, like glass ready to shatter. It felt as if one more step, one wrong word, and everything I loved would be ripped away from me. I knew this wasn't just about gossip or spite. This was about an entire church, powerful, influential, and certain of its right to decide who deserves to be a mother and who doesn't. And their decision had already been made. I needed to be removed from my children's lives.
I stepped aside, letting them in because I knew refusing would only make me look worse. The woman's eyes scanned the living room like she was reading a checklist in her mind. Walls clean, toys scattered, no visible danger. My kids looked up from the floor wide-eyed, sensing that something wasn't right. The man with the folder stayed silent, writing notes as if my life were already a case file. "We received several detailed complaints," the woman said, her voice calm but sharp. "They allege neglect and concerns about your moral fitness as a parent." The words hit me harder than I expected. Moral fitness. That wasn't about my home. It was about me. About my faith. About the fact that I didn't belong to my husband's church and had no intention of joining. I could almost hear my mother-in-law's voice dripping with piety, telling her congregation how lost I was, how my children deserved to be raised in the truth. They didn't care about my parenting. They cared about control. I felt my jaw tighten as I answered their questions, careful not to let my anger spill over. Every answer was a battle, each word measured, each smile forced. All the while in my mind, I was piecing it together. This wasn't just a visit. This was the opening move in a game they'd been planning for months.
That night, after the inspectors left, I sat at the kitchen table long after the kids were asleep. The silence in the house felt heavy, like the air before a storm. My husband, Mark, came home late, smelling faintly of aftershave and something else, something unfamiliar. He didn't ask how the day went. He didn't even look surprised when I told him CPS had shown up. He just shrugged, like he already knew. That's when the pit in my stomach hardened into something darker. "Did you know about this?" I asked, my voice low but trembling. He busied himself hanging up his jacket, avoiding my eyes. "People talk, and maybe if you didn't give them reasons." His words sliced through me. He was supposed to be my partner, but in that moment, I saw the truth. He was their ally. The church wasn't just his family's faith, it was his identity, his allegiance. And if they told him his wife was a threat to the children's souls, he'd believe them over me. I realized I couldn't trust him to protect us. Not from his mother, not from the pastor, not from the whispered judgments that could turn into legal action. I stared at him across the kitchen, my mind already moving ahead, calculating what I would need to do to keep my children safe. The first time I met his church, I thought it was just intense. The women all wore long skirts, no makeup, and their hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. The men stood in small clusters, speaking in low, serious tones. But it wasn't the clothes or the rules that unsettled me. It was the way they looked at me, like I was a stray dog someone had led into their pristine garden. Mark's mother introduced me as his wife from outside, and I remember wondering why that detail mattered so much. Over the years, I learned outsiders were projects, people to be fixed, converted, purified. And if they resisted, they were obstacles. I tried to keep my distance, but marriage makes lines blurry, especially when your children are involved. My kids loved visiting their grandmother's house, where there were always cookies, stories, and smiles. But behind those smiles, I started noticing things. Subtle comments about mommy's wrong beliefs, or how God wants children to be with those who follow him. At first, I told myself it was harmless, until the day I overheard my daughter asking if she would still see me after Jesus comes to take us home. That night I cried in the bathroom, not just because my child was confused, but because I knew exactly who had planted that idea. And now, with CPS knocking on my door, I realized this had been building for years. 2 days later, Mark's mother dropped by unannounced. She never came alone. This time she brought Sister Elaine, one of the church elders' wives. They sat at my kitchen table, smiling like diplomats at a peace talk, but every word they spoke was a weapon. "We're worried about the children's future," Elaine began, folding her hands neatly. "They need spiritual stability, especially in times like these." Mark's mother leaned forward, her voice soft but cutting. "And with all the confusion in your background, we think it might be best if they spent more time with us for their own good." My pulse was pounding in my ears. I asked them to leave. Elaine's smile didn't falter, but her tone hardened. "We just want what God wants, and if that means going through the proper channels, we will." Proper channels. I knew exactly what that meant. Court, lawyers, character witnesses from their congregation, painting me as an unfit mother because I didn't follow their faith. When the door finally closed behind them, I realized something chilling. This wasn't a warning. This was step 2 in a plan they had already set in motion. They weren't just threatening me, they were preparing to take my children.
I didn't have to wait long for proof. That weekend, my neighbor Lisa knocked on my door holding an envelope she'd found mistakenly delivered to her mailbox. My hand shook as I slid a finger under the seal. Inside was a typed letter on official stationery from a local family court mediator. My name was there in black and white, alongside Mark's. It referenced concerns regarding the children's religious and moral upbringing and requested a preliminary meeting. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a bluff. They had already gone to the authorities. I called Mark at work, my voice trembling, demanding to know if he'd filed anything. His silence on the other end told me more than words could. When he finally spoke, it was with that careful calm he used when he wanted me to feel like I was overreacting. They just want what's best for the kids. Maybe they're right. My knees nearly gave out. This was no longer just his mother's fight. Mark was standing with them. I hung up, my heart thudding in my chest. Suddenly, my home didn't feel safe. Every corner seemed to whisper that my time with my children was running out. And the worst part? I didn't even know the full extent of what they'd already told the court. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with nothing but a notebook, a pen, and the dull hum of the refrigerator for company. Fear was still there, coiled tight in my chest, but something else was beginning to rise beneath it. Resolve. If they wanted to paint me as an unfit mother, I would force the truth into the light. I started by writing down every incident, every conversation, every veiled threat Mark's family had made since the day I met them. Dates, places, witnesses, anything that could stand up in court. I dug out old text messages from Mark's mother, the ones where she questioned my moral influence, and saved them to a separate folder. I even called Lisa back to ask if she'd be willing to testify about the letter. She agreed without hesitation. As I worked, I realized this wasn't just about winning a legal battle.
It was about surviving a siege. These people had been in my life for years, smiling at Christmas dinners while quietly judging every move I made. Now they'd finally found their excuse to push me out of my children's lives. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. They believed I was fragile, that I'd fold under pressure. They were wrong, very wrong.
It happened the following Sunday when Mark took the kids to visit Grandma after church. I tried to play it calm, told myself I had nothing to worry about, but a knot twisted in my stomach the entire afternoon. When they came home, I noticed the shift instantly. My daughter, only 8, avoided my eyes, mumbling answers to my questions. My son, 6, clung to his backpack like it was a shield. Later that evening, as I was folding laundry in their room, I overheard them whispering. My daughter's small voice carried a weight that no child should bear. Grandma says we might have to live with her soon because Mommy doesn't love Jesus the right way. My blood went cold. I wanted to storm into the living room, call Mark, call his mother, scream until the walls shook. But I forced myself to stay quiet, to listen, to remember every word. They weren't just trying to take my kids through the courts. They were planting seeds in their minds, trying to make them believe they'd be better off without me. It was cruel, calculated, and it made my resolve harden into something like steel. If they thought they could turn my own children against me, they were about to find out how far a mother will go when her family is under attack.
I decided confrontation was too easy for them to dismiss. If I accused Mark without proof, he'd twist my words, call me paranoid, maybe even use my anger as evidence that I was unstable. No, this had to be done carefully. The next weekend, when Mark announced he was taking the kids to his mother's after church again, I smiled and nodded as if nothing was wrong. But instead of going home, I followed them. I parked 2 houses down from her place, low in my seat, watching the front door through the gap between hedges. 30 minutes passed before my heart nearly stopped. I saw his mother usher the kids into the living room, Mark right beside her, both of them leaning close as if sharing a secret. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her hand on my daughter's shoulder, saw her lips moving slowly, deliberately, like she was reciting something she wanted burned into their memories. Then my daughter glanced toward the window, her little face tight with unease, and I had to fight every instant to run inside and pull her out. Instead, I took out my phone and began recording video through the windshield. It wasn't perfect, but it showed enough. The kids, the hushed voices, the way Mark's mother shook her head with mock sadness when my son asked a question. This wasn't family bonding. This was indoctrination. And now I finally had something I could use.
I didn't rush to show anyone the video. Not yet. Part of me wanted to run straight to a lawyer, slam my phone on their desk, and demand they see what was happening. But another part, the quieter, colder part, knew I needed more. One clip could be explained away. They'd say it was just a family conversation, that I was reading into things. So I kept it close, replaying it in the dark after the kids were asleep, each time noticing a new detail. The way Mark's mother pressed her palms together when she spoke, like she was praying over them. The way Mark didn't just stand there, but nodded along, smiling in that rehearsed, self-satisfied way. I started keeping a small notebook in my purse, jotting down every odd phrase the kids repeated after visiting her. Mommy doesn't follow the true path, or Grandma says God chooses better parents. I never pushed them for more. I didn't want them to feel they were betraying anyone. I just listened. And with each page, the truth became harder to deny. They weren't waiting for a court date. They were waging a slow, steady war for my children's hearts and minds, one visit at a time. I knew I couldn't let it go on much longer without stepping in. But if I move too soon, I might lose my only chance to end it for good.
I chose a friend first. Not just any friend, Carla. We'd known each other since college, and she had this rare ability to hear me without judging, without rushing to fix things before fully understanding them. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where the hiss of the espresso machine and the low hum of conversations made it easy to blend in. I slid into the booth across from her, my hands trembling as I unlocked my phone. "You need to see this," I said, and pressed play on the video. She leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she watched. When it ended, she sat back, silent for a moment. "That's not just grandma talk," she said finally, her voice low. "That's conditioning. They're planting seeds." I swallowed hard, the words hitting me like a confirmation of my worst fears. Carla asked about the notebook, and I pulled it from my bag, letting her read page after page of the strange accusatory phrases. By the time she closed it, her expression was set in stone. "You need legal protection," she said, "now, before they try something bigger." Hearing it from her, a voice that had no stake in my marriage, no reason to exaggerate, was both terrifying and clarifying. It meant I wasn't imagining this. It meant the fight for my children had already started, whether I wanted it or not. 2 days later, I walked into a family law office that smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee. The receptionist's polite smile did little to settle the knot in my stomach. When the lawyer, Miss Donnelly, caught me in, I felt as if I were stepping into a confessional. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't waste words. I laid out everything: the notebook, the video, the strange behavior from my kids, and the constant push from Mark's family to have them stay longer during visits. She didn't flinch. "You're dealing with a group that believes they're above civil law," she said after a moment. "If they think their faith grants them ownership of your children, they'll escalate. You can't treat this as a family misunderstanding anymore." She explained my options: filing for formal custody review, petitioning for supervised visits, and gathering as much evidence as possible. Each word felt heavy, because I knew the moment I took legal action, the gloves would come off. Miss Donnelly leaned forward, her gaze locked on mine. "If you want to keep your children safe, you have to accept that your husband and his family may never see you as anything but the enemy from here on." I nodded, my throat tight. I hadn't come here for comfort. I'd come here for a plan, and now I had one. But walking out of that office, clutching a folder of legal documents, I understood the cost. There was no turning back. I didn't have to tell Mark I'd been to see a lawyer. He found out on his own. That evening, when he came to pick up the kids for his scheduled visit, his smile was tight, his movements sharper than usual. "So," he said, leaning against the door frame, "you've decided to lawyer up." It wasn't a question. My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice even. "I'm protecting our children." His laugh was humorless, cold. From their own father? From their own family? I met his gaze and didn't blink. From anyone who thinks they can take them away from me because of what I believe or don't believe. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw the faint shadow of something I'd never fully admitted to myself before: contempt. He didn't try to argue. He just said, "You've made this war," and turned to leave. But as he walked away, I noticed he didn't call the kids by name to say goodbye. It was as if in that moment he had stopped seeing them as ours and started seeing them as his to win back. The door clicked shut behind him, and I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The fight had officially gone from quiet hostility to open battle.
I just didn't know yet how far he and the church were willing to go.
The first shot from their side didn't come as a late-night knock or a shouted confrontation. It came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope slid under my door. No return address, just my name printed neatly in black ink. Inside was a formal letter from a law firm I'd never heard of, citing concerns regarding the moral and spiritual welfare of my children. The wording was sharp but indirect, dressed up in polite legal language, as if they were doing me a favor by informing me of my own unfitness. They wanted a mediation to discuss custody adjustments, an offer that was, in reality, a threat. I sat at my kitchen table, the paper trembling in my hands, my coffee growing cold beside me. I could see their fingerprints all over it, the church's way of cloaking their judgment in official legitimacy. They weren't storming my house or screaming in my face. No, they were smarter than that. They were going to bleed me slowly, one legal bill at a time, until I either gave up or lost everything. I called Carla immediately, my voice shaking. "They've made it official," I said. She didn't hesitate. "Good. Now it's all on record. You fight them where they think they're strongest." I wished I had her confidence, but the truth was I could already feel the ground shifting under me. This wasn't just about belief anymore, it was about power, and I was staring straight into the machinery that would grind me down if I let it. I didn't sleep the night before the mediation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my kids being led away, their small hands slipping out of mine, while Mark's mother looked on with that cold satisfaction she thought passed for righteousness. By morning, my nerves were so frayed I could barely lace up my boots. Carla drove me to the law office, a modest brick building with a glass door that reflected my pale, tight-lipped face back at me. Inside, they'd arranged the conference room like a battlefield. Mark, his mother, and 2 lawyers on one side, me and my attorney, Mr. Jacobs, on the other. Sitting across from them, I was struck by how calm they looked, as if they were certain of the outcome before a word was spoken. The mediator, a woman with a clipped tone and a folder full of proposals, opened with talk of finding common ground for the children's sake. But it was clear this wasn't about the children, it was about control. They spoke of my inconsistent moral environment, the confusion my faith might cause, the stability offered by their church community. I kept my hands flat on the table, fighting the urge to throw my chair back and scream. Mr. Jacobs countered calmly, methodically, dismantling each of their claims with school records, character references, and the fact that I had been the sole primary caregiver since birth. Still, every word from their side dripped with condescension, a subtle insistence that I was, at my core, unworthy. By the time it ended, I knew this was only round 1, and they weren't going to stop until they either won or I broke.
2 days later, I found out just how far they were willing to go. I had gone to the elementary school for the annual book fair, one of those simple events the kids look forward to for weeks. I was standing with Lily, helping her choose between 2 picture books, when I felt that unmistakable chill crawl up my spine. Turning, I saw Mark's mother at the end of the aisle, flanked by 2 women from her church, all of them dressed in those prim, matching skirts and white blouses, their expressions sharp as knives. Before I could react, she strode right up to Lily, bending down with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sweetheart," she said, loud enough for the surrounding parents to hear, "we've been praying for you and your brother. Soon you'll be in a proper home where you can be raised the right way." My stomach dropped. Lily's little hand tightened around mine, and I could feel her trembling. "That's enough," I said, stepping between them. But one of the other women chimed in, her voice syrupy and poisonous. "It's not too late to repent, dear. You could join us and prove you're fit to be their mother." Heads turned. Whispers started. The principal, clearly uncomfortable, came over and asked us to take the conversation outside. But by then the damage was done. They'd made their scene, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of anyone watching. As we walked to the car, Lily clutched her books like a shield and asked, "Mom, are they going to take me away?" I had to swallow hard before I could answer, because the truth was, I didn't know how to promise her they wouldn't. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with nothing but a cup of cold coffee and the weight of every threat they'd thrown at me.
I knew now that waiting and hoping this would pass was no longer an option. They weren't going to stop, not until they had my children in their hands. And if the legal system was even half as influenced by their connections as I feared, I needed more than a lawyer's assurances. I needed evidence, real, undeniable proof that would make any judge think twice before granting them custody. I opened my laptop and started digging. Late night forums, ex-member blogs, court filings from other states. Piece by piece, a picture began to form. Stories of families split apart, of children re-educated in isolation, of parents who tried to leave and were hounded into bankruptcy. And then I found it. A lawsuit filed 10 years ago in a neighboring county, naming Mark's mother as a spiritual overseer who had sanctioned the removal of a child from her father's care without legal authority. The case had been dismissed on a technicality, but the allegations were there in black and white. My pulse quickened. I copied every file, every archived article, every statement from survivors. I didn't care how long it would take. I was going to build a wall of truth so high they'd never climb over it. Outside the kitchen window, the street was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was the first sign that they already knew I'd decided to fight back. 2 days later, the first warning came. It was subtle enough that to anyone else, it might have looked like nothing, but I knew better. I came out to the driveway that morning to find my car's rear tires slashed. Not cut deep enough to be obvious at first glance, but just enough that they'd blow out if I drove more than a few miles. A folded piece of paper was tucked under the wiper. No handwriting, just a printed Bible verse. A house divided against itself will not stand. No signature, no explanation. My stomach dropped. I'd read enough of their doctrine to know exactly what they were saying. Stop fighting, or we'll break you apart completely. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I was afraid that filing a report without direct proof of who did it would only make me look paranoid, unstable, exactly the image they were trying to paint. That evening, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street, engine off, 2 figures inside. They didn't look at me, but they didn't leave either. When Mark came home, I asked casually if he knew whose car it was. He barely glanced outside before saying, "Probably someone from church checking in on us," like it was the most natural thing in the world. My chest tightened. He wasn't hiding it anymore. Not the surveillance, not the intimidation. They wanted me to feel surrounded, and it was working. But what they didn't know was that fear has a strange way of sharpening you. I started documenting everything: times, dates, photos, license plates. If they were going to push me into a corner, I'd make sure they couldn't deny what they'd done when the truth finally came out. It was during one of the church's family outreach nights that I first saw her. A woman standing off to the side, not singing, not smiling, just watching. She looked maybe 10 years older than me, with silver streaks in her dark hair and a face that seemed carved from quiet defiance. I'd been dragged there by Mark, who insisted it would show good faith to the elders. The room was warm with too many bodies, and the air carried that strange mix of incense and something metallic, like old coins. People moved in tight clusters, whispering, nodding. I felt eyes on me from every direction, cataloging my every move. Then I caught the woman's gaze. It wasn't the glassy, obedient stare I'd grown used to seeing here. It was alert, focused. And there was something else in it. Warning. She didn't approach me that night, but when I stepped outside for air, she slipped out a side door and crossed the parking lot like she had a purpose. "You don't know me," she said in a low voice, "and you can trust anyone here, not even your husband." My heart kicked hard against my ribs. She glanced over her shoulder. "They've done this before. You're not the first mother they've tried to take children from, but you might be the first who can stop them." She pressed a small folded paper into my palm, her fingers cold, her grip urgent. Before I could ask her name, she was gone, back into the building, swallowed by the crowd. I unfolded the note later in the bathroom, my hands shaking. An address, a time, no explanation. I didn't know if it was a trap or a lifeline, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something dangerous and precious. Hope. The address led me to the edge of town, to a narrow street where the houses seemed forgotten by time. Paint peeling, porches sagging, yards littered with rusted bicycles and sun-bleached plastic chairs. The number on the note matched a small, one-story house with curtains drawn tight despite the late afternoon light. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Every instinct told me to turn around. But then I pictured my children, Eli's gentle laugh, Rosie's tiny fingers curling around mine, and I forced myself to step out of the car. The porch creaked under my weight. Before I could knock, the door opened just enough for one dark eye to appear. It was her, the woman from the church. She scanned the street before ushering me in quickly, locking the door behind me. The air inside was heavy with the smell of old coffee and cedar. "You came," she said, like she hadn't been sure I would. She slid me into a cramped living room where stacks of papers and manila folders covered a low coffee table. "Everything you think you know about them is a fraction of the truth," she began. She slid a folder toward me. Inside were copies of court records, restraining orders, and custody agreements, all with different names but the same church listed somewhere in the background. "They target mothers like you," she said. "Mothers they can paint as unfit because they don't follow the church's rules. Once the children are inside the congregation full-time, they disappear from public life." My stomach turned. "Disappear?" She nodded, her face grave. "Some get sent to training facilities. Others are placed with loyal families, and some—" She hesitated, as if weighing whether I could handle the rest. "Some never come back at all." My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "Why are you helping me?" Her eyes softened. "Because they took my daughter, and I'm gonna make sure it never happens to yours." Her gaze dropped to the floor, as if saying it out loud would summon ghosts she'd spent years trying to bury. Her name was Mariah. She was 9. I'd already left the church. Too many roles, too much control. But my ex-husband stayed. When he remarried, his new wife convinced him I was poisoning Mariah's mind with worldly ideas. Her lips trembled, but she kept going. One Sunday, they took her to service and never brought her back. I called the police, hired lawyers, begged for help. But the church had its own legal team, and they made me out to be an unfit mother. They forged documents, attendance records, testimonies from so-called neighbors who said I left Mariah alone at night. None of it was true, but in court, it looked airtight. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking on the next words. That was 12 years ago. I haven't seen her since. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. My chest hurt just listening. "So you think they'll try that with me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded without hesitation. "They've already started. Those custody complaints you've been hearing about, those aren't coincidences. They're building a case against you, same way they did with me. You're unsafe because you're outside their faith." My mind spun with images of courtrooms, lawyers, and my kids looking at me like I was a stranger. "What do I do?" I asked, desperation slipping into my voice. She leaned in, lowering hers. "You need to gather proof before they do. Document everything, every call, every visit, every strange interaction. And don't confront them yet. They feed off confrontation. You have to outsmart them quietly." For the first time, I saw something in her eyes besides pain, something sharp and unyielding. If you play it right, you can win. But if you make one wrong move, you'll lose them. Forever. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn manila envelope, its edges frayed as if it had been opened and closed too many times. "I didn't plan on showing you this tonight," she said, "but you need to see it before it's too late." She slid the envelope across the table, and I hesitated before pulling out its contents. Inside were photocopies of emails, dozens of them, between my husband and what looked like members of the church's leadership. The subject lines alone made my stomach knot. Custody strategy.
Documenting Unfit Parenting, Faith-Based Placement Options. I skimmed one email and felt my face heat up. We have already gathered multiple statements from trusted congregation members willing to testify that she has displayed erratic behavior, uses inappropriate language around the children, and has expressed hostility toward our beliefs. None of it was true. None of it. What the hell is this? I whispered, my voice shaking. She didn't answer right away. Just let me read more. There were notes about coordinating testimonies and scheduling interviews with friendly evaluators. I didn't even know what friendly evaluators meant until I read further. We recommend using Sister K as the court-appointed family counselor. She understands our mission. The implications hit me like a punch to the chest. They weren't just planning to take my kids. They were laying out every brick in the road to get there. "Where did you get these?" I finally asked, my throat dry. She gave a humorless smile. "From someone who still has a conscience in that place. Someone who saw what they're doing to you and couldn't stomach it." The room felt colder now. My hands were trembling so badly I had to set the papers down before I tore them. "You have a choice," she said quietly. "You can pretend you don't know and hope they stop, or you can start fighting now."
She leaned in, lowering her voice like the walls themselves might be listening. "They're going to paint you as unstable. That's the first step. They'll say you're emotionally erratic, that your temper makes you dangerous to the children. They'll twist every disagreement, every moment of exhaustion into proof you're unfit." I thought back to the last few weeks, how my husband had been provoking me, needling me about the smallest things, often in front of the kids. "He's been baiting me," I whispered, realization dawning. She nodded. "Exactly. Every raised voice, every slammed door, it's all being documented. They'll have members of the congregation coincidentally around to witness it, and those people will testify. They'll even go after your friends, claim they saw you drink too much or neglect the kids." The words felt like barbed wire wrapping tighter around my ribs. "And it won't stop there," she continued. "They'll bring up your faith, or rather, the lack of it. They'll say the children are spiritually endangered under your care, that they need to be raised properly to be saved. It'll be the cornerstone of their argument, not just that you're a bad mother, but that you're a danger to their souls." I gripped the edge of the table, fighting the urge to be sick. It wasn't just about custody, it was about erasing me from my children's lives entirely, body and spirit. They have lawyers who've done this before. And if you walk into that courtroom unprepared, you won't stand a chance. I swallowed hard. My pulse thundered in my ears. The envelope lay between us, a damning roadmap of how my life could be dismantled piece by piece. "How much time do I have?" I asked. Her answer was immediate, and it chilled me. "Not enough." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my children's faces, confused, frightened, calling for me while strangers in dark suits led them away. I lay there in the dark, the clock ticking loud enough to keep pace with my racing thoughts, and understood one thing with terrifying clarity. Waiting to react would be the same as surrendering. If they were building a case, I would build a defense, not the kind you scramble for at the last minute, but a wall so solid they'd have to tear themselves apart trying to breach it. The next morning, I started small. I bought a notebook, just an ordinary spiral-bound thing from the corner store, and began writing down everything. Every conversation with my husband, every odd look from his mother, every interaction with the church members who seemed suddenly more interested in my spiritual journey than ever before. Dates, times, words, frozen on paper where they couldn't be twisted later.
I also reached out to people they couldn't intimidate. My childhood friend in Denver, who'd seen how devoted I was to my kids. My old neighbor, who remembered when I was the one organizing food drives while my husband was away on church business. They agreed to speak for me if it came to that. But it wasn't enough to play defense. I needed to understand the machinery I was up against, the legal and religious entanglements they'd use. I spent hours in the library combing through case studies of religious custody battles. Most ended badly for the outsider parent. That made me angry enough to stay another 3 hours, highlighting the few that didn't. By the end of the week, my notebook was filling fast, and my exhaustion had settled into something sharper, resolute. If they wanted to paint me as unfit, I would force them to do it under a spotlight so bright the whole world could see the brush in their hands. And maybe, just maybe, I could turn their own doctrine into the rope they'd hang themselves with.
The turning point came on a damp Thursday morning when I spotted 2 men from the church standing across the street from my house. They weren't talking to each other, just watching. One leaned against a lamppost, pretending to check his phone. The other stood with his hands in his pockets, scanning the windows. I didn't panic, not outwardly. I pulled the curtain shut, but instead of retreating, I positioned myself where I could watch them without being seen. My pulse was steady, my mind already cataloging every detail: height, build, the color of their jackets. I wrote it all down in the notebook. When they finally walked away, I didn't call my husband because I knew exactly what he'd say. You're imagining things. You're letting your prejudice against the church poison your mind. No. I needed proof he couldn't dismiss. So I drove to a pawn shop 3 towns over and bought a used camera, one with a long lens and no paper trail. From that day forward, I became my own surveillance team. If they followed me, I had photos. If they knocked on the door, I had recordings. It wasn't about paranoia anymore. It was about leverage. In custody battles, the one who controls the narrative wins. They had their story. Me, the lost soul leading her children into moral ruin. I needed a better one. Them, the zealots, using faith as a weapon to tear a family apart. That evening, as I was reviewing the grainy shots of the 2 men loitering, I caught sight of my reflection in the darkened laptop screen. My hair was a mess. My eyes ringed with shadows, but I didn't look scared anymore. I looked determined. It hit me then that I was no longer just a mother fighting to keep my children. I was an opponent in a war they didn't know I'd already declared. And if I played this right, I wouldn't just win. I'd make sure they never tried this with another mother again.
The next move had to be quiet, deliberate, something they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. I started by visiting the county courthouse, slipping into the records office under the pretense of family research. What I was really looking for were any public filings tied to the church, lawsuits, custody disputes, anything that painted them as dangerous or manipulative. It didn't take long. 3 cases in the past decade, all buried in dusty folders no one cared to read. Each told a variation of the same story. Non-member parent loses custody to the member parent after the church supported them through the legal process. The language was always polite, phrases like moral upbringing and faith-based environment, but the pattern was unmistakable. I made copies of everything, slid them into a plain folder. That folder became my shield, the thing I carried with me everywhere. At home, I kept my guard up. My husband had grown colder. Not overtly cruel, but detached, as if I were already fading from his life. He spent more time at the church than with the kids. When he was home, he would ask strange, pointed questions. Do you think the kids are happy here? Wouldn't it be better if they had more structure? I knew those words weren't his. They were fed to him, rehearsed in those echoing walls where they prayed and plotted. I started locking my bedroom door at night, not because I thought he'd hurt me, but because I couldn't risk anyone taking my children while I slept. That might sound extreme, but in my gut I knew
If they decided the time was right, they wouldn't hesitate. One night, as I was tucking the kids into bed, my daughter whispered, "Daddy says soon we'll go live somewhere better. Will you come too?" I smiled, kissed her forehead, and told her yes. But inside, I felt the ground shift. They were already planting the idea in my children's minds. I realized then I wasn't racing the clock. I was already behind.
I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house, and tried to map out every possible move they could make. If they were smart, and I knew they were, they wouldn't try anything openly. It would be subtle, legal, wrapped in the language of concern for the children's welfare. By the time anyone realized what was happening, my kids would be living under their roof with weekend visits arranged like some generous favor. The idea made my chest ache. I needed someone on my side, someone who could see through the church's smiling facade. But my family lived out of state, and the few friends I trusted had already been pushed away by the tension in our home. That was when it hit me. I didn't need a friend. I needed an ally who understood the law. The next morning, I called a family attorney 2 towns over. I didn't give details over the phone, just said I needed advice about a complicated custody concern. She agreed to see me the next day. When I arrived, I brought the folder, the lawsuits, the photographs, my notes, months of quiet collecting. I laid it all out on her desk, half expecting her to roll her eyes and tell me I was overreacting. But she didn't. She read, she asked questions, and then she looked me straight in the eye and said, "If half of this is true, you need to be prepared for a legal fight. They've done this before. They'll do it again." Something in me both sunk and solidified. I had wanted confirmation, but hearing it out loud made it real. Before I left, she slid her card across the table. "Call me if anything changes, especially if you think they're about to make a move." I tucked it into my wallet like it was a lifeline, because now I knew the fight wasn't coming one day. It had already started. The shift in my husband's behavior became impossible to ignore. He had always been a man of routine, coffee at the same time every morning, checking the news on his phone before work, but lately his patterns were off. He'd leave earlier, come home later, and sometimes return smelling faintly of incense, the same scent that clung to the church's meeting hall. One evening, I heard him on the phone in the garage. The door was shut, but his voice carried just enough through the thin walls for me to catch fragments. "Ready by next month. She won't resist if it's framed right. The children will adjust." My heart pounded so hard, I was afraid he'd hear it from the other side of the door. When he came back inside, his face was perfectly neutral, as if nothing had happened. He asked me about dinner. I smiled and answered, but my mind was already racing. I decided I couldn't just sit and wait for them to strike. I had to create a paper trail, a record of everything suspicious, so if they tried to claim I was unfit or unstable, I could prove otherwise. I bought a small voice recorder and started keeping it in my pocket during conversations. I also kept a handwritten journal, dated and signed, documenting anything that felt off. Strange questions from my husband, comments from the kids about moving somewhere better, unexpected visits from church members. Every page felt like a piece of armor. That weekend, the church invited us to a family retreat. It was presented as a wholesome getaway, hiking, group meals, campfire singing. But when I saw the schedule, my stomach tightened. There were separate discussion circles for children and parents, overnight cabins divided by age group. In other words, they'd have my children away from me in the middle of nowhere. I smiled politely, thanked them for the invitation, and said I'd check our calendar. Inside, my decision was instant. We were not going. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps felt impossibly steep. My lawyer walked beside me, his briefcase swinging with every step.
while I clutched a file so tightly my knuckles were white. Inside were photographs, school records, statements from teachers, and the letter from the child psychologist who had interviewed my kids. Proof, cold, hard proof that my children were safe, loved, and thriving with me. Across the steps, they stood together like an army. My husband, his mother Eleanor, and 3 members of their church council. They didn't look at me, but I could feel their disdain like a weight pressing on my chest. Eleanor was dressed in severe black, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her lips moving as if in prayer, or perhaps rehearsing the lies she was about to tell. In the courtroom, their lawyer painted me as a danger to my own children. He spoke of my moral failings, of how my lack of faith made me unfit. I sat still, breathing slowly, refusing to let my hands shake. When it was my turn, I didn't look at Eleanor or my husband. I looked only at the judge, and I told the truth. Every word, every detail, not the story they'd crafted, but the real one, about a mother fighting for her children against a machine built on fear and control. When I finished, there was a silence so heavy I could hear the tick of the clock above the bench. The judge leaned forward, scanning the papers before him. My heart pounded so loudly it was almost deafening. I didn't know yet which way the decision would go, but in that moment, I realized something profound. Even if I lost, I had stood my ground. I had refused to bow to their power. And that, in its own way, was a victory.
The judge's voice was steady, deliberate. This court finds no evidence that the children are in danger under their mother's care. Custody will remain with the petitioner. It took a moment for the words to sink in. My lawyer squeezed my arm, but I barely felt it. Across the aisle, Eleanor's face went white, her mouth tightening into a thin, bloodless line. My husband slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him as though he'd been punched in the gut. The church council members exchanged quick, sharp glances, like soldiers realizing they'd just lost the battle. I wanted to cry, to laugh, to collapse all at once, but instead, I kept my head high as the bailiff announced the court was adjourned. My children were safe. The machine had failed, and for the first time in months, the knot in my chest began to loosen. Outside, the sun was blinding. I stood on the courthouse steps, letting the warmth soak into my skin, breathing in air that finally felt clean. My lawyer said something about next steps and paperwork, but his words blurred in my ears. All I could think about was going home to my kids, holding them close and knowing no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could take them from me now. Still, I understood this wasn't the end. The church might not come for me in court again, but people like Eleanor didn't just walk away. They nursed grudges, waited for cracks, and struck when you least expected it. But now, I wasn't the same woman I'd been at the start of this nightmare. I was sharper, stronger, and unafraid to fight. If they came again, I'd be ready. And this time, they'd know exactly what kind of mother they were up against.